Got it. Okay. And hello, everyone. Hi, everyone on YouTube. We'll get started in just a minute. Welcome, everyone, to Zoom. We'll start the recording in here. And recording in progress. All right, welcome, everyone. Welcome to another Water, Wetlands, and Watersheds seminar. We are all virtual today, but we have the great honor and privilege of having Melissa Hill with us today. So Melissa Hill is a program manager for the National Wildlife Federation's Gulf Program. Her work is centered on addressing resilience issues, habitat protection, and water quality needs along Florida's Gulf Coast. She has her master's here from UF in interdisciplinary ecology and the certificate in environmental education and communication. She's published her research in human dimensions using surveys and interviews to determine Florida homeowners' understanding of coastal conservation easements, threats from erosion, and impacts to threatened and endangered species, including sea turtles. Prior to joining NWF's Gulf program, she served as land acquisition specialist and watershed coordinator here for the Alachua Conservation Trust. During this time, she worked with state and federal agencies to basically do all of the paperwork, community building, relationship building to get lands into conservation. And so she's met a lot of people. She's convinced a lot of people to help advance conservation and continues to try to do that, I think, in many ways. So Melissa, the floor is yours. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'll just take a moment to get my screen pulled up and then we can dive into it, but it's a pleasure to be here. So hang tight while I do that.
All right, thanks. We always quiz people to do that like on the fly, so. Looks perfect, excellent.
All right, I'm glad I avoided that Zoom taboo of having to go back out and come back in, but it's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm really excited to be joining the seminar. So thank you so much for having me and to get to engage in this conversation. And I'll just start off by saying that this is going to be a very different talk than you've had up to this point. In seminar, there is not a single data finding, there is not a single chart of scientific published paper that I'll be talking about. It's all policy and communications in terms of science for water quality and coastal resilience. So I'm excited to talk about it with you today. And I'll go ahead and hop into it. So for my work as a program manager, I get to use my background as a scientist and help to further analyze and advocate for the best possible outcomes for our natural resources. And I get to work specifically in Florida, even though I'm a part of the Gulf program. And it's great because I get to use my background that David mentioned to further habitat protection and coastal resilience in the state at scale. Today, I'm going to give a quick overview of our organization. I think it helps in terms of understanding the work we do. Then I'm going to dive into the main topic for today, which is really laws and rulemaking at the state level. And then we're going to go into some case studies, specifically the Florida Clean Waterways Act, which passed in 2020, and 2021 statewide flooding and sea level rise adaptation and planning, which passed in 2021, this last session. So then we'll hopefully have some good time for questions and some discussion around the presentation as a whole. So when you think of NWF, you might think of Ranger Rick. He was my first introduction to this nonprofit as well, sitting in my dentist's office when I was a little kid reading a magazine. And Ranger Rick is one of the prime examples of the variety of reach and breadth that this organization has. NWF is the nation's largest and oldest nonprofit conservation, education, and advocacy organization in the United States. We have over 7 million members and supporters, and we have 51 state and territorial affiliated organizations. NWF was founded in 1936, and our mission is to unite all Americans to ensure wildlife thrives in a rapidly changing world. And much of our work really focuses on bringing science to decision makers, engaging stakeholders in wildlife issues, and leveraging policy at a local and federal level. We're a true federation in the sense that our nonprofit has state affiliates. So in Florida, the state affiliate is the Florida Wildlife Federation, and then you pretty much just change the first name over again 50 times until you've listed all of our affiliates. And our affiliates really help shape our broader conservation agenda and have voting authority on certain processes in NWF, but we are a separate, unique nonprofit. And the work we do across the country is really broad ranging. So we do wildlife crossings in Los Angeles. We engage students through our Earth Tomorrow program in Atlanta. We work with our Tribal Partnerships program in close partnership with tribal governments for over 2 decades to help bring buffalo back to tribal lands. We also work to create restoration plans for the Great Lakes. So the scope of what we do is big, and within this big map, I work in the South Central region, specifically along those 5 Gulf states. So there's a long history of what we do, but our org really prides ourselves on having a wide umbrella of stakeholders that engage in these issues. And I wanted to share this cartoon. NWF shares it a lot, but it really shows the intention of our organization to bring diverse groups to unite and demand that policymakers take action to save dwindling wildlife and their habitats. And it's really the core backbone of our work to bring together hunters and anglers and climbers and conservationists and farmers to push this broader policy agenda. For background specifically on the Gulf program, which is where I work, the National Wildlife Federation's Gulf program really focuses on providing solutions to support healthy water, sustainable ecosystems for the Gulf people and wildlife. And our strategic plan, which covers 5 years, we're into the thick of it now, it really focuses on 3 main buckets, which is habitat restoration, climate change and coastal resilience, and the protection of marine environment. And just some of our highlights from our time working in the Gulf, it's a lot longer than this, but just some really top tier ones. We've influenced the development of the coastal master plans in Louisiana and Texas, which the second act today that I'm going to talk about is essentially Florida stepping up and creating its own version of a coastal and inland master plan to prevent flooding and sea level rise impacts. So we've done that throughout the Gulf, worked really closely in Louisiana and Texas to engage stakeholders and work with decision makers in that process. We also helped pass and write and secure the passage of the Restore Act in 2012. And we've successfully advocated for more than $2 billion in restoration projects to date, from spill-related fines and penalties. For anyone familiar with this funding pool, those funds are still ongoing. They're still being spent out. Applications are still happening, so that work is ongoing today. And then we've done a lot of work in Florida, specifically in the past, in terms of Everglades restoration. And in 2022 alone, it was a bumper year. We successfully helped secure over $1 billion in federal funds under the bipartisan infrastructure law for Everglades restoration through the Army Corps of Engineers. So that's NWF. And I apologize if I belabored on the background of this organization, but I think it's really important to remember that the goal of NWF is to bring science to the decision makers. So that's really what this talk is about. And let's dive into the focus of it, which is how rulemaking impacts how the state of Florida drives water quality changes and resilience planning. So as I mentioned earlier, this slideshow has no graphs, no recently published findings, like in your previous talks, but it does unpack a lot of the regulatory and systemic framework that our waters and coasts are either degraded or improved by. So I think it's really important to understand the process. All right, here are some absolutely bananas flowcharts, which are provided by the House, respectively, and the Senate. But this is to give a quick overview of how rulemaking fits into the process for Florida. And first, before we can do that, we have to do a quick rundown of how a law is crafted in Florida, which are these flowcharts. And we can either follow along to see how they explain it to the general public through the charts themselves, or I could just run you through it real quickly. So I'll do the second. And I'm sure you've heard it before. In a simplified version, legislators propose bills, which is passed favorably by both the House and by both houses, are approved by the governor, and they become a law. As you can see, though, there's a lot more steps along the way in the lawmaking process, which creates a lot of opportunity for a proposed bill to either die or change from its original language. Sometimes that changes for the benefit, sometimes it's for its detriment. And I think it's worth highlighting some of these spaces where the public and organizations like ours can work to change the language of the bill or have it fail before becoming a law. And so when a bill is first filed, it gets referred to several committee steps along the way to be reviewed by smaller groups of members. And through the committee process, the bill is really heavily discussed and debated. There's opportunity for public comment and testimony to be given. And this is the space where amendments or changes can be added to the bill. And this process allows for the idea to, in theory, be very thoroughly discussed and debated by the legislators, and the public and those specific people who the bill will affect can give input. And after passing out of the committees, it's brought before the entire chamber, the House and Senate. And each bill must be passed by both chambers before it becomes law. It goes to the governor's office. The governor can sign the bill, allow it to become a law without his signature, or veto the bill. And if it's not signed, it becomes law de facto come July 1st. And so if a bill doesn't make it all the way through this process before the end of session, this bill dies and has to begin the process anew next year. So, as we just discussed, constitutionally, the legislative branch is writing laws, and the executive branch is supposed to be the one to carry out those laws. But in 1961, give or take, legislative members had become increasingly concerned that Florida was being, in essence, run by a phantom government. So they found that unelected bureaucrats, like folks in state agencies, were actually running the state largely through the use of crafted rules or agency memos that were not necessarily in compliance with the law themselves. So why was this a problem? Here's 3 things that probably would have made it into the top 10 list if you were listing the issues with that system. 1, Florida citizens found this really frustrating because all of a sudden they could be subjected to rules that were not even written down, let alone published. Another issue, number 2, concerns arose about the impartiality of the hearings that were being conducted by agency employees that had created the rule themselves when a citizen was accused of a rule violation. Another issue, 3, is that by creating and upholding rules, agencies and administrators had more direct impact on the people of Florida than sometimes the elected officials themselves. And so, as you could tell, the legislative branch wasn't too happy as senators and representatives who would work for the defeat of a certain provision in the language of the bill, justifying that later that exact same language was an administrative rule or an agency memo a few months later. So how did the state seek to remedy all this? Well, they did it by regulating and formalizing the rulemaking itself. So the Administrative Procedures Act, which is this nice brochure cover you have over here, it's a light, I think 130-page document summarizing all of its nuances, but quick rundown is it was created in 1961, revamped in 1974 with a lot of amendments occurring kind of every year following to improve the language. And this wasn't new. Florida was following examples of the federal government and other states to address this debacle. And what it does is it allows for check and balance function by increasing agency accountability. It prevents unauthorized or unpublished laws from occurring. It creates opportunity of formalized opportunities for citizen input and the rulemaking process, and affords more rights to citizens to hopefully influence those rules. And it also clarifies the rulemaking authority. And in laws that are passed, it's either allowed by the statute or required by the statute. And when I say rulemaking authority, the agencies that are doing this, specifically for this talk, we're going to be focusing in on some of the rulemaking that's done by an agency like the Florida Department of Environmental Protection or the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Those have rulemaking authority. And I should note that the APA thus allows for the administrative rulemaking and what is referred to as negotiated rulemaking. So there's 2 different main types of rulemaking that can be done. But first, we're going to cover what administrative or traditional rulemaking is first. So first, I'm going to discuss traditional rulemaking, which folks would typically think, if you have something published, you can make comments. And that's it exactly. It mandates that public input be received in the form of comments, and it has to be considered by the rulemaking agency as the rule progresses towards final adoption. How do you keep up with rulemaking? You already have to keep up with lawmaking, right? So there's this really nifty website called flrules.org, and agencies are required to publish information on this website. Sometimes they'll do it on their own as well in conjunction with it. And say what you will about the design or the functionality of the site, I am a huge fan of this blue heron with a stack of books. So that's at least something enjoyable to see when you go on and read a bunch of legalese. But the way it works, went too fast. First, on this, you'll go ahead and find the relevant rule that you're interested in, and the agency will have notice of development of rulemaking. This is followed by a developmental workshop. So the agency can hold a workshop on its own or because a member of the public requested a workshop. And I'll say that not all rulemaking has a workshop automatically. And if they don't, though, you can have it if you get it requested. So the development workshop itself will happen, which is where if the agency does not already have text for a draft rule, the workshop is a chance to make suggestions of what should be included in the rule. And if the agency does have the text, then the workshop is a chance to offer comments and critique of what is in the rule. Then you'll have a notice of the proposed rule itself. There's a public comment period for 21 days after the publication of the notice of the proposed rule. And you can comment directly to the agency contact that's listed or sometimes through the floridarules.org website itself. After that, there will be a hearing on the proposed rule, which will be held after the 21-day public comment period has ended. The hearing will be kind of that last final chance to give comments on the proposed rule. You can do that. Sometimes it'll be in person or written comments submitted at the hearing. And then comes changes and adoption. So the change and adoption phase occur with little public input, and any changes made to the rule must come from public comment or comment from the legislators committee that ultimately reviews the rules. Once this happens, the rule is approved by an agency head and filed with the Department of State. After it's been filed, the rule becomes effective 20 days afterwards, or on a later date specified in the notice or upon legislative ratification. And I'll say this is the process for traditional rulemaking that we talked about. And usually traditional rulemaking, the state deems adequate for most things, most topics. However, some rules occasionally present challenges that the traditional process is ill-equipped to address. And that includes a lot of topics that involve our water quality. And it's for these situations that the legislature provides agencies with an alternative mechanism called, quote, negotiated rulemaking. And agencies do this when rules are really complex and they're being drafted and they know that there's going to be strong opposition to the rules. And so they're allowed to create an advisory committee. The advisory committee then follows the similar-esque process, but they themselves are drafting rules, and they have a lot of formal meetings and convenings to discuss the science and draft language. And TACs are formed to ideally represent a full suite of experts and representative stakeholders that are interested in that rule, or that you would potentially see pushback from should it pass. All right, how's everyone doing? That was a lot. Here's the reason why it matters, why keeping up with rulemaking and lawmaking at the state is really important for scientists and really important for anyone who cares about the quality and quantity of our water at large. So here's just some ongoing, really hot topics being rulemaking right now, which you can participate in if you choose to. So some include outstanding Florida springs. Right now, the regulation of consumptive uses of water and the definition of harmful withdrawals is having a rulemaking process. That comment period is open until the 8th, so this week, so get your comments in. Additionally, minimum flows and levels for the lower Santa Fe and Ichetuckney rivers is being developed. And this rule amendment would be used as a basis for imposing limitations on withdrawals of groundwater and surface water in the consumptive use permit process, as well as for reviewing proposed surface water management systems in the environmental resource permit regulatory process. Also for the Resilient Florida Grants Program. We're going to talk about this a little later, but this is the ranking and scoring criteria that DEP is going to use to fund millions and millions of dollars of projects along our coasts and inland communities facing flood risk. Additionally, the Stormwater Rulemaking Technical Advisory has wrapped up their meetings, but the rule itself is still ongoing. And this is working to incorporate the latest scientific data to direct the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and our water management districts on how to update stormwater design, operation, and regulation. And the On-Site Sewage Treatment and Disposal System Technical Advisory Committee, they've wrapped up their meetings, and we'll talk about this a little later as well, but they were asked to make requirements for the physical locations of OSTDS, or setbacks, in essence, and the marketplace availability and use of associated enhanced nutrient reducing technology, and more. These are just the ones that I personally have been keeping up with. So there's even more rules that are constantly being created and ultimately passed that have a direct impact on our quality of life in the state. So laws can either allow or require rulemaking. And in both the creation of the law and the process of rulemaking, there's a lot of opportunity for change and, almost more importantly, for input, for public input, collective efforts led by nonprofits, through public comments. I'm sure if any of you all are, following along with a Florida-based nonprofit, you probably have gotten a couple of action alerts asking you to email or call, and all those things matter. It's a cumulative effort. And now I want to take a temperature check on current water and resilience measures and talk about what exactly is churning through the state now or nearing completion. So for today's discussion, we're going to talk about the 2 laws that have come through and then a couple of associated ongoing rulemaking that pertains to them. So first up, we're going to talk about the 2021 statewide flooding and sea level rise resilience law that passed, and specifically we're going to do an update on the rulemaking for the Resilience Florida grant program. Then we're going to talk about the 2022 Florida Clean Waterways Act, which had a lot of buzz, and I think is really important to keep up with how well that law is playing out in our state. And so we're going to do an update on the rulemaking for septic and for stormwater. And I'll also just add the caveat that more bills than this have passed and are on the docket to potentially become law come this July 1st. But for the sake of time and to be able to do a bit of a deep dive, I've just chosen these 2 case studies to go through this process and focus on these pieces of legislation. So, all right, first up, 2021 Senate Bill 1954 Act relating to statewide flooding and sea level rise resilience. This is a huge piece of legislation to pass the state last year and was done so with overwhelmingly bipartisan support. And while this bill nor any other related bills are actually directly addressing climate change drivers for sea level rise and increase in inland and coastal flooding, this bill does do a lot to bring Florida into the statewide resilience planning scene. In the Gulf Coast, I'll just say that Texas and Louisiana are leaps and bounds ahead of Florida in this process. And so it's really important that we have allocated funding and staff to now begin this, even though we're a little late to the party overall. And this bill, one of the most important things it did was create the Office of Resiliency and Coastal Protection within the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and it has a few main proponents within it. So these are the 5 main buckets within the law itself, and I'll dig into them more in the next slide. But before I explain these buckets further, I'll just note that another bill from this past session, 2022, House Bill 7053 is up for approval. And if it will pass, a preview of things that could come, or likely to come, a few things will be added to the scope of this, which would include establishing the statewide Office of Resilience within the Executive Office of the Governor, and that would be led by our Chief Resilience Officer. It would also require for a flood resilience report to be made by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and our Chief Resilience Officer. The Florida Department of Transportation, FDOT, they will have to create a state highway systems resilience action plan. And within these 5 buckets that I have up on the screen, they themselves will see a few changes in terms of scope or funding or some of the more finer details of the programs that are already in existence. Okay, so 5 main buckets. For the previous year of this program being implemented, I'm going to run through these buckets just to share some of the funding stats and the bigger scope for what it is. There's more nuance to it, but just for a grasp of what the program is working to do in the state as a whole. Within the Resilient Florida Grants Program, which is the grant-making arm of this piece of law, it provides funding for 2 different types of primary grants. The first is planning grants. And these planning grants are available for local cities and counties to provide funding for comprehensive plan amendments to address perils of flood and to create vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans in order to protect critical assets that are at risk from flooding and sea level rise. In fiscal year 21 to 22, it saw $20 million in state funding. The second grant program that they have is the Resilience Project. And this past year, there was $500 million of federal funds that was allocated to pay for this grant program, which actually pays for flood risk and reduction projects themselves. So within this grant program, you have more of the vulnerability assessment side, the planning grants options, and then the implementation side with the Resilience Project. Next up is the comprehensive statewide flood vulnerability data set and assessment. And this is one of the biggest deliverables from this law and really elevates planning as a whole at the state level. The comprehensive statewide flood vulnerability and sea level rise data set and assessment is essentially creating a 5-year plan vulnerability assessment that will catalog critical assets at the state level, have more granular use of sea level rise data, and ultimately be the broader statewide plan that drives this bigger process. And there's 2 of those components within it. The first is the data itself. So by July 1st, 2022, the deliverable was to develop a statewide data set, which included statewide sea level rise projections, containing information necessary to determine risk of flooding and sea level rise to inland and coastal communities. You'll see in that box, I said 2022/2023. If the bill that I talked about from this past session does pass, it pushes that timeline back as a deliverable for folks, and that seems likely at this point. Next is the statewide assessment itself, which would use the statewide data set to identify vulnerable infrastructure, geographic areas, and communities, and include an inventory of critical assets. And once again, that was to be due in 2023, but if it passes, that timeline gets shifted back. And combine these two, create a master plan at a 5-year intervals to hopefully mitigate climate change from risks from sea level rise and flooding. And complementing this is our next column, the statewide flooding and sea level rise resilience plan. This plan is based on funded projects that are funded through the Resilience Grant Program, i.e. column 1 that I have up there. And this plan is updated based on new rounds of applications that come in annually and still account for multi-year projects throughout it. So it has a 3-year planning horizon, but that is annually the plan is created and it's basically showing multi-year projects within it. And starting in December 1st, 2023, this is supposed to be based on the statewide assessment. So moving from having communities require their own local level vulnerability assessments to either continue doing that or utilize the statewide plan to bolster their project applications. If you want to see this, the first version is really just a project list, like a couple pages on a PDF you can download, but it does let you know the cost of associated projects and where those projects will be happening. Next up, regional resilience entities. So this is complementing the Resilient Florida Grant Program, but while the Resilient Florida Grant Program is more specific to individual cities and county efforts, the regional resilience entity grant is for multi-jurisdictional projects. And in fiscal year 21, this had only $2 million allocated, so it's a much smaller funding pool. And then last is the Florida Flood Hub. And the Florida Flood Hub, the way this fits into this bigger picture is it is creating our data. So for the data that is going into the comprehensive statewide flood vulnerability data set and assessment, the Florida Flood Hub is creating that data set, and I'm going to do more on this in the next slide. But overall, this is a resilience program with data and project components that results both in an updated annual project plan and that shows the 3-year funding horizon for those projects, and has a comprehensive 5-year plan that has data sets from Florida Flood Hub. And now to cover a few of these in some more detail. So I think a lot of folks are really interested from the science community in the Florida Flood Hub, so I'll spend some time on this. And I'm going to lump together the statewide assessment and the hub into one talking point since they're intricately related. The hub itself is legislatively decided to be based within University of South Florida's School of Marine Sciences. And it will serve as the lead institution to coordinate efforts to support applied research and innovation to address flooding and sea level rise in the state. Currently, this effort at USF is being led by former University of Florida School of Natural Resources and Environment Director and former Chief Science Officer for the state, Dr. Tom Frazier. The hub must conduct activities specified in the bill that we've been talking about, and it has to include developing data and modeling from working groups of scientists, coordinating research funds across entities, establishing community-based programs, and ultimately assisting with training and workforce development of state employees. Every year, they're going to have to provide an annual report on the hub's goals and progress that they've made to the governor and the legislature each July 1st. So stay tuned for that one. And the data will also directly feed the 5-year comprehensive statewide flood assessment. The kickoff process for the Flood Hub has been slow. And I think in part that was because their appropriated $4 million to do this work was decided to be run as a contract through the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. And if any of y'all have had the pleasure of receiving state or federal funds, sometimes that contracting process can go on for a really long time. And that's what happened to them. So if this upcoming piece of legislation passes, they'll actually be able to do direct appropriations instead of the contracting process. But that's recently been passed, and now their immediate effort is really focused on developing sea level rise projections, and that's being done through working groups, which is the model they're going to be implementing for getting most of these data sets together. So the first work group is devoted to developing sea level rise projections for the state, and it's not just people from USF, it's other state university systems, other agencies like folks from Scripps. There's someone who's an author on an IPCC report, as well as someone from NOAA. And the working groups are intended to have around 10 to 11 folks, and the lead for this one is Dr. Gary Mitchum, who is a USF professor. And some updates that will happen for this process should HB 7053 from the 2022 session pass is that it will require the hub to provide tidal and storm surge flooding data to be included in the vulnerability assessment that are conducted and pursuant to the Resilience Florida grant program. Additionally, the bill is going to require the hub to provide rainfall-induced and compound flooding data sets, but it also still authorizes the use of more localized data or modeling for folks that are working to address these problems. And it would change their appropriations to be direct from the legislature instead of through DEP. And they are poised to be refunded this upcoming year as well. So next, I'm going to talk about the Resilient Florida Grants Program. And this is where project demand really speaks for the need at the state level for funding for resilience projects and for help in the planning process overall. I just wanted to take a moment to highlight those numbers for y'all. So in this grant making process, we talked about the planning grants. In fiscal year 21, there were 191 applicants, which totaled over $90 million worth of projects, and only $20 million was awarded. And then for the resilience grants, the project implementation themselves, there were 275 applicants within that pool that totaled $1.7 billion worth of projects. 190 projects in total were actually funded. And you can see in this pie chart breakdown, which I guess I did have a chart for y'all. This is my chart. You can see that the bulk of it was really on stormwater management system improvements. About a quarter of the projects were on living shorelines and nature-based solutions. There was some retrofits to critical facilities, a little bit of elevating existing structures, and then hard shoreline armoring through seawalls. So I just wanted to take a moment to call out the funding need at the state because upcoming funding levels for these grants are going to continue for the next year. So it looks like another 20 million for the planning grants, another 500 million for resilience grants. But as this process continues, as Florida gets up to speed and more communities become aware of this and start planning for this project, it's going to require a huge investment. And there's ongoing rulemaking, which we're going to talk about that next. So I mentioned that some agencies are nice and they have the time and capacity to put their rulemaking notice on their website. So this is a clip from the Resilient Florida program website, and just a real quick status update on how this is going. So this rulemaking specifically looks to create the point and ranking criteria for their grant funding process. And why is this worth participating in? Well, obviously, as I just showed on the last slide, there's a high demand for these types of funds, such that the applicant rate is outpacing the funding availability. So you can imagine the level of interest that this process has had for folks working to be competitive for this grant. And this rulemaking process was a priority for NWF to participate in because we brought our expertise from around the Gulf and our equity lens to provide feedback on the ranking and scoring criteria for the grant program. And while certain criteria is required by statute, we still wanted to give feedback on the ways it can hopefully incorporate a forward-looking planning lens, not just addressing flooding issues that are happening today, but projected in the future. Make sure that regional applications, so working between those jurisdictional boundaries, that they're not scored lower than individual applications. To elevate the value of nature-based solutions in the grant point award process, and to suggest ways for under-resourced and understaffed communities to still have really competitive applications. And so the notice went out in August of 2021. The updated notice and info on the workshop came out in February. The workshop was held this past March, both in person and online. And there was a really high attendance, I'd say, for the online component. I was sitting in the room. It was me and I think a handful of other people that made the drive to Tallahassee. And then the comments were due at the end of last month. And we are currently waiting on a revised rule. And I'll say that working on the rulemaking process is really important if you plan to do it or are interested in doing it, to work to establish a good working relationship with the staff. They have lives outside of work, and being able to work with them as they balance the task of balancing statutory obligations and engaging with the public in a meaningful way, it definitely helps the process. And this public comment period, I learned this yesterday, it had over 500 comments, which is an incredible volume. But if you think about the direct impact that this has on funding competitiveness and for all the different people that will be applying around the state, it makes sense for the high level of engagement. So stay tuned for your grant scoring criteria for the Florida Resilience Program. Next, I'm going to dive into another law, Senate Bill 712, which passed in 2020, Florida Clean Waterways Act. And so we're going to shift gears here. And this legislation passed with unanimous bipartisan support and carries a wide range of water quality protection provisions aimed at minimizing impacts of known sources of nutrient pollution and strengthening regulatory requirements. So what all did it cover exactly? I'm going to go through each of the main buckets and highlight what it was supposed to be addressing, and then we're going to dive into two of the specific bullet points, do a bit of a case study on the rulemaking efforts and how well it addressed the intent. So first up, on-site sewage treatment and disposal systems, septic tanks, right? So this bill transferred OSPD's regulation from Department of Health to Department of Environmental Protection. It created a rule that you have to have setbacks, and it also deleted the Department of Health Technical Advisory Committee. So we'll have more on this on the next slide. And it requires local governments to develop remediation plans within BMAP if the Department of Environmental Protection determines that septic tanks are contributing at least 20% of the nutrient pollution, or if the Department of Environmental Protection determines remediation is necessary to achieve the total maximum daily load. That's one component of this bill. Next up is wastewater. And there's a lot of nuance on this one that I haven't had the opportunity to engage in. So in the interest of time, I'll just say that it instructed the Department of Environmental Protection to adopt rules to reasonably limit, reduce, and eliminate domestic wastewater system leaks. Next is stormwater. This required DEP and water management districts by January 1st of 2021 to initiate rulemaking. And that rulemaking had to include updates to the Environmental Resource Permit Applicant's Handbook, kind of this guiding piece of material for stormwater design criteria and installation. And it also required that DEP include this in the rule development. And I'll talk more on this in the following slide to dive into this. But another component of the Florida Clean Waterways Act is agriculture. This saw some really big changes for the Florida Department of Agricultural and Consumer Services, or DAC. And it led to the creation of the NARF, which, if any of you knew the former director, Chris Pettit, he would say that it sounds like that's a sound a dog would make, NARF, but it's a nutrient applicant record form. And so it required for producers to provide applicant records annually, which is something that the state hadn't been doing previously. It also included a large mass mailing to producers and to move forward to having on-site biannual inspections for those enrolled in best management practices. And it also allowed DACs or university ag programs to make their own legislative budget requests. Biosolids. So this required DEP to adopt rules for biosolid management and a decent amount of other items, and I'm not going to dive into this too much for the sake of time. Water quality monitoring. This created a real-time water quality monitoring program, which was subject to appropriation, but it is housed within the EP itself. There also had some language in the law related to bottled water. So this bill required a unanimous vote by a water management governing board to approve a consumptive use permit if there was going to be Springs bottled water. This provision expires June 30th, 2022. It also requires Department of Environmental Protection in coordination with water management districts to have conducted a study on bottled water industry and use in the state. This study has been conducted, but there wasn't any requirement for implementing the recommendations of that study. Next, rights of nature. So this bill prohibited local governments from providing legal rights to any, quote, plant, animal, body of water, or other part of natural environment unless otherwise specifically authorized by state law or the state constitution. So this is a classic example of a preemption from the state. I think a lot of folks, especially in this past cycle, were either brutally reminded of or just had the attention brought to them that the state likes to preempt local governments, counties and cities from handling issues at a local level. And this is another one of those preemptions that the state has seen in the past few years. Next up is fines, which isn't that exciting. It just increased the fines for admin penalties from $10,000 to $50,000. So, and this bill overall was really hailed as being landmark. But I would argue that the proof is in the pudding in terms of effectiveness and how this bill has actually impacted our water quality in the state. And a lot of that, in terms of the rollout, is tied both in the language of the Senate bill itself, but also in the rulemaking and how much teeth those forthcoming regulations actually have. And I think two of these big ones that I want to talk about today is stormwater and on-site sewage treatment and disposal systems. So here we go. Section 8 of the Florida Clean Waterways Act, as we just discussed, required DEP to convene a TAC, a technical advisory committee. So this is the example of the negotiated rulemaking that we talked about earlier. For the Resilient Florida Grant Program, that was more of the traditional rulemaking, and this is the use of technical advisory committee. And the TAC was set to provide recommendations to Governor DeSantis and the Florida Legislature regarding requirements for the physical location of OSPDs. And in addition to that charge, they also had to determine marketplace availability and the introduction of using enhanced nutrient reducing tech in Florida. The TAC had 10 members from various stakeholder groups, and I'll give a little bit of background at this point, which you all can see on the slide. So as we all know, septic tanks are a large source of nutrients in our water bodies. And I put up this graphic provided by the Southwest Florida Water Management District. But I'll just say in essence that the call to this TAC was extremely important, right? To get these setbacks identified, to have firm rules in place to address this nutrient loading issue that we're having in our waterways and systems was key. And so starting in August 25th of last year, the TAC met, and they were able to meet a total of 6 times, which was shorter than their allowed period to be meeting. But it wrapped up quickly. And based on the Florida law, they had to have their recommendations in by January 1st of 2022, which they did. They finalized their recommendations December 29th. And there was also, I'll flag a tangential discussion on the work that the TAC did by the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, which was really interesting. I don't know who has an extra 2 hours to go back and watch a webinar, but if you do, it's worth watching the most recent Blue-Green Algae Task Force meeting in February to see this ongoing discussion of the rules that came into place. And how did these rules do? Well, up here I included the law itself and the calls for the TAC or what they actually had to recommend. And despite this clear direction, DEP had declined to update the setback distances. So throughout this rulemaking process, it was a lot of the main point of discussion was how far are these systems having to be set back? And there was not a recommendation that was put forth. And some of this was cited for a lack of research. However, there is certainly enough research to show that the current standards are not protective enough. And with the current population boom that Florida is experiencing, this means that new septic systems will continue to be installed in environmentally sensitive areas and negatively impact our waterways. And while that is happening, simultaneously, the state is using grant funding to remove septic tanks and to update septic to sewer conversions at scale. So if you make a simple box model, it's a losing solution, right? To continue to allow the same standard while on the back end spending money to address the issue. It's a little backwards, but a lot of good, smart people are working on it. Furthermore, the task force recommended that there would be, quote, broader regulatory oversight of on-site sewage treatment and disposal systems to ensure that those systems are functioning properly. So essentially getting to this presumption of compliance that they're installed and they're functioning. And I think this is a really important thing to understand when we're thinking about these types of regulatory systems is this presumption of compliance. And within this recommendation, this presumption has not been addressed by the current proposed rules, meaning that the 2.5 million septic systems in the state of Florida will continue to operate without any assurances to whether they're functioning properly or harming nearby waterways. So that's an update on the TAC. The rules have not been formally adopted, but they have been finalized and been put forward for consideration. Next up, the Stormwater Technical Advisory Committee. So some background on this. There's different types of stormwater treatment systems, but the basic idea is that these systems will collect and store runoff for long enough that the nutrients and other pollutants settle out, percolate through the soil, and be absorbed by the vegetation. So That's how the nutrient loading is being addressed in the system. And for background, the current standards at the state, the current stormwater rules set a minimum treatment performance standard that these stormwater systems achieve at least an 80% reduction in the annual loads of pollutants that would cause or contribute to violations of state water quality standards for most waterways. And once again, this presumption of compliance, that if it was built in the allowed design criteria, according to the state, then it's meeting the reduction goals. And studies have shown over and over again that this presumption of compliance is wrong to meet the nutrient reduction criteria standards for both nitrogen and phosphorus. And so recognizing that regulations were not adequately protecting water quality, the state actually undertook this process back in 2007. From 2007 to 2011, the state had an effort to revise the stormwater regulations, but after years of workshopping and drafting, the proposed revisions were shelved, and nothing was done with them. So that's a bit of background, setting the stage for this rulemaking process. Here comes the stormwater tax. So DEP convenes their own technical advisory committee, has 13 members, representative stakeholders, experts in the field, and they have 13 meetings that kick off in December of 2020 and run through just about the end of 2021. And they complete a final summary report, which just got published March 31st of this year, so only a couple days ago. So I apologize, I haven't been able to dig into the final version of this report. However, I can comment on the version that was most agreed upon prior to this one.
And Melissa, I'm sorry to jump in. We are approaching near the end of the seminar time, so I don't know. So if you can give us like the quick and dirty version of this one, so we have a few moments for questions. I'm sorry I didn't warn you earlier.
Absolutely, yeah. Sorry about that. I can wrap it up in 1 minute. So here we go. Yeah, so anyways, this TAC, it was supposed to have the rules adopted in July 1st, but it looks like the deadline has been pushed back to October 2022. And kind of the main topics that were discussed in this TAC was the definition of impaired waters, the rulemaking process itself, defining what pre-development and post-development means in terms of stormwater updates, having guidance on retrofitting standards, and also the presumption of compliance that these systems are working. So with that, questions.
Awesome, thank you, Melissa. Let's give Melissa a round of applause for excellent dive through this somewhat arduous process of rulemaking, and also just preemptively thanking you and your organization for keeping an eye on all of this process, as well as the content. So we'll open it up first to the Zoom room. I'll go check YouTube and see if we have any questions over there. Mark, I see you're unmuted. Do you have a question?
Yeah, and thank you, Melissa. This is, the bureaucracy of this whole process is mind-boggling, and I appreciate folks like yourself that somehow can seemingly understand that complexity, or at least navigate it. Maybe understanding is over a simplification, but I guess the fundamental question I have goes back to this, or is linked to this idea of presumption of compliance versus kind of performance-based. And so many of our regulations are based on presumptions of compliance. And I understand the kind of the rationale based on some design criteria or whatever, but do you think there's ever a way to get into the rulemaking process, or as some sort of compliance component, a true performance-based effort? I think the big challenge with that is if when you enter into some sort of infrastructure and you want to put it into place, you want to have some assurance that that's going to work on both sides. But if we know that then it doesn't work, how do we hold somebody account to that? Because it's not just the structure sometimes, it's how it's managed, it's how the inputs are components of that. So either way, bottom line, do you think we could ever move to a performance-based criteria?
Yeah, great question. And I will agree that it is navigating not necessarily always understanding. And big shout out to organizations like Waterkeepers of Florida, specifically Jen Lomberg does an amazing job of tracking and distilling all this information. So I always turn to her if I have a question. But yeah, this question of compliance and being able to actually implement a performance standard, describing this process, there's so many spaces for bottlenecking, and there's so many places for a good idea to lose, whether that's in the lawmaking itself or what gets done with the recommendations from a technical advisory committee and how much weight it actually carries. And I think that a lot of it has to do with the recommendations that come out of it. I think a lot of technical advisory committees have brilliant minds on them and do come up with some innovative solutions to have that scientific metric to see how well these systems are working. Whether that's scalable in the sense that the idea is feasible, or that the staff capacity from the state agency to do that type of monitoring exists, are all things that have to be worked out, but I gotta believe that it can be done. Otherwise, folks wouldn't have been recommending it for years. And if it can't be done, then we need to find a different space to solve the problem. If it's not in monitoring, then it needs to be in the systems themselves, in the design.
Thank you.
Thanks. Melissa, so I was wondering, when you were showing the 5 elements, the 5 like baskets that were in the resilience bill, and with the flooding vulnerability assessment, is that is like the scope there just for coastal flooding, sea level rise or surge or storm flooding, or does it also include inland flooding? So we have a lot of impacts both to built and like agricultural environment from freshwater flooding of inland communities.
Yeah. Absolutely. The answer is both. So Florida is really unique. I said we were behind in terms of resilience planning, but what Florida has taken on, and I think rightfully so, is to look at the entire state's flood risk. And so while Louisiana and Texas have brilliant coastal master plans, those don't necessarily extend throughout their entire jurisdiction of state boundary. Florida, these funds, the Resilient Florida grant funds, are available to inland communities that experience flooding. Alachua County actually is the recipient of one of them. They're top on the list thanks to alphabetical order when they show the plan. But inland communities are eligible as well. And so it's not just sea level rise, but it's flood risk as a whole.
Right. So I can see how inland community would apply for resiliency funding, but specifically for this vulnerability mapping. And so, we're interested in it from, sort of like the science and technology of how you do that at large scale accurately, really at small scale and large scale, right? Because you want to do it accurately in space, but you're going to do it over a large place, right? The entire state. So I guess, is that within the purview of that second column of that vulnerability assessment to look at vulnerability of the entire state for flood risk?
Yeah, so the data set is a component of it.
Right.
And in terms of the interpretation of the data and what's actually going to be in that assessment, I think that everyone's still curious about how that's going to look, and we have to wait a couple of years for that to roll out. But those data sets are really being driven by the Flood Hub at USF. And so I encourage folks to reach out to Tom Fraser with that, or if you have interest in the sea level rise projections himself, Gary Mitchum. And those working groups are supposed to be coming online as more and more of those data sets are being created. And so, hopefully in terms of the inland flooding, maybe there would be one specifically for that.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Any other questions from the Zoom group? Christine, I see you unmuted.
Yeah, I have a question, which is it generally true that the Clean Waterways Act is more about sort of understanding what maybe should be done through essentially the guidance of the Technical Advisory Committee? It seems like rather than actually projects on the ground, like it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of like funding funneled through the Clean Waterway Act. Is that true for actually like projects that would improve water quality? It's more like providing input and guidance on what should be done?
Yes, I think on its best day, the Clean Waterways Act is to be intended as strengthening those regulatory measures as the intent. I will say, as far as the scorecard, or if you're going to do a grade scale on how well it's doing at actually, addressing stormwater infrastructure issues or addressing septic setbacks, I think it's supposed to be a bit more of addressing the issues themselves, but not necessarily that capital project improvement, which is a substantial difference between the Clean Waterways Act and the Resilient Florida program, right? They're doing kind of that both component.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot less teeth to it because you don't actually, and anyways, it's interesting. The legislation is just very different in its kind of language. I didn't understand that until you explained that today. So thank you. So it's really nice overview.
All right, well, let's give Melissa another round of applause. Thank you so much for taking away from your time there in Tampa and sharing with us, something we don't often see. We look at the science and we hope the science somehow just gets its way into policy, but it's not obviously a one-step process, as you helped show us in your very first slide of the flow chart. So we really appreciate you coming and speaking with us today. And we'll see everyone else next week. I believe our speaker next week will be in person. I will double check and let you all know by email. But if you'd like to attend in the room here, we'll see you then. Otherwise, we'll see you online. Thanks, everyone.
Great.
Thank you. Thanks, Melissa.
everybody.
That was really